welcome back to Radio Entrepreneurs. Very excited to be coming from Fenway Park, legendary Fenway Park today. And alongside me in the co-host seat, Anne Mostue, Sapers and Wallack. Always a pleasure to host with you.
Always a pleasure to be here, Jonathan. And I know we have a home run of a guest today. Very excited to introduce her.
We're in the presence of radio royalty.
You got that, Jonathan. We have Anne Mostue, former news anchor of Bloomberg and NPR. Thank you so much for being here today.
Sure, thank you, Evan. Jonathan, thank you so much for having me.
And you're blushing because you're the expert, and I feel like, we're amongst radio royalty and media royalty here, and I feel like you're talking to a bunch of, a couple of amateurs here that are kind of to hopefully do a legitimate job of asking you some questions.
Well, you are true entrepreneurs, and I was live radio more than anything. I didn't have to produce a podcast, so you have a lot more work in some ways.
So tell us a little bit about your background, because I know it is an exciting background, and you worked for many years in media and covered some interesting things, which we won't go into, but tell us a little bit about your background and your observations over the years, and how the medium changed as media evolved and all that. So.
Yeah, sure. Well, I went to journalism school. I grew up in the Boston area, went to Boston University for grad school in journalism, was very interested in print, and ended up getting a job as a business writer up in Maine at the Bangor Daily News, which is a great newspaper up there. And then I had interned at WBUR, perhaps when you were there, and fell in love with radio, but kind of put it aside because my first job was in newspapers. And then ended up being hired to be the northern and eastern Maine reporter for NPR up there. There's a station based in Portland, but I was up in Orono, and drove around in a four-wheel drive car with my dog, finding stories about lobstermen and the blueberry season and ski season, and then ended up getting hired to work in Western Mass in radio, and then came to GBH in Boston, and then to Bloomberg for the last 7 years. Mm-hmm. And now I'm doing more media coaching and training. I have 2 young children, but I had fabulous mentors in radio. I love radio. It's so, it's a theater of the mind, right? But it's so accessible wherever you are. And one of the things I always talk about is breaking news on radio was the fastest thing I ever did. I remember I was reporting on the Boston Marathon when the bombings happened. Mm-hmm. I was right near the finish line, and I immediately called the news line for NPR in DC at the mothership and got on the air telling them what I was seeing and what was going on. And it was like the fastest way to break that news on the air versus a newspaper or a television station that has to come set up a camera. So it was great. I mean, it's just a fabulous medium. I'm glad you guys are keeping it going.
No, it's wonderful that you say the theater of the mind, because I often find, you could sit in front of a television, not knocking television, and watch a sports game. But if you listen to it, audio only, it really gets your mind going, and the visualization of all of it. And it's fascinating. And the same thing, NPR, obviously, the storytelling, things of that nature, where you really have to wrap your mind around it and the sound and all of that. It's fascinating. And I still have the image of you for somehow I'm like eliciting Fargo, the big hat, and driving around Eastern Maine looking for stories.
I did. One of the best stories I did was with the state bear biologist in Maine, who took me out to tag cubs, and he tranquilized the mother, and I recorded her snoring, and then recorded the cubs whimpering, and it was just an incredible story. And, like these wild experiences I had. Public radio is great because you're sort of a general assignment reporter. Yeah. Whereas in newspapers and at Bloomberg, I was really strictly a business reporter, which was what I studied, and it was exciting to do that. But it was so much fun to sort of get to do creative pieces with sound.
So curious about that. When you're in the hinterlands of northern Maine or eastern Maine or up there, you're not traveling with a producer. You're generally traveling by yourself, and so you're making the decision as to what audio you want to grab, what sounds you want to grab. So it really lends itself to that creative element.
That's totally true.
Was it typical that you would get a lot of material and then have to really spend time editing it down? And again, the challenge in media and news in particular is the cycle. The cycle keeps moving. So if it's a timely, topical news story, you got to work fast.
That's exactly right. Right. When you're your own producer, reporter, photographer, you would sometimes get 6 hours worth of sound at an event and then have to turn into a 6-minute radio story, which is really hard. you're constantly editing while you're interviewing people, thinking, oh, that's a line I'm going to use. And then, I mean, it was it was so much fun in that way, though, because I got to make all the decisions, And then it was just me and my laptop, basically. And if I could find Wi-Fi at a McDonald's, that's where I would edit that day, and send it in to the studios, and the engineers would kind of finesse.
Make it all sound consistent.
Yeah, thank goodness for engineers. And then it would get on the air. But it was fun. I mean, it was lonely, I have to be honest. You're in your 20s, you live in Maine alone with your dog, and you're out reporting all day. The reality is it was kind of a lonely existence, but the reporting side was really fun.
I'm sure the dog really appreciated to go along with you for all your trips.
Yeah, she was great. She was a good dog.
And you have such a passion for helping people, which I think is phenomenal. If we look back over the past 10 years of the podcasting radio industry and look at where it is today, everyone has an iPhone, there's all these TikTok trends. Anybody could just start recording themselves and put a channel up there. I know you had a lot of thoughts on, what people should be doing today if they want to have a successful podcast. Maybe they're trying to promote their home cooking show, or maybe they're a DIYer. What do you think people should do today to maximize kind of getting their viewership out there for whatever passion they're trying to pursue?
That's a great question, Evan. I think quality matters much more than people think. So the fact that you have great microphones, you have a great setup, you're also filming so you can be on YouTube or wherever you'd like, is great. And I can't get over how many people try to record a podcast at their kitchen table with an echo, and they're using their iPhone, and it just doesn't sound good. And I really don't think listeners are going to stick with a podcast that doesn't sound good. At least get in your closet and be in a padded area with a carpet and some clothes to pad the echo. And then obviously social media is a huge part of getting the word out. You can't wait for somebody to write about your podcast or talk about it publicly. You've got to self-promote, and I see a lot of people doing that. You guys are doing a great job on LinkedIn with that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that wherever you can get your word out that you have a podcast, like you say, you're competing with millions of people on Spotify, iTunes, wherever, and it's really tough. And I have some friends, a couple of lawyers who started a podcast, and they're trying to make it their business. And so they're creating live events, which seems to make sense, ticketed events. They're partnering with retailers and local wine shops to sponsor. They're very, very aggressive in asking for sponsorship. That seems to work for a lot of people. But again, if you can get a good studio space, if you can get a good sound and some good guests, just ask whoever you can and make sure that it's informative and entertaining. I'm always surprised at how few people are funny. Like, you listen to a podcast and people are kind of shooting the breeze, and they're not funny, even comedians sometimes. And I think you've just got to lighten things up. You know what I mean?
No,
I mean, it depends
absolutely.
on the topic. But
it depends on the ego, right? If people think they're funny in their own kitchen table, and then, you get out in the real world and people say, guy's not so funny.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of par for the course. But, I guess also one of the questions I have is I think people are trying to be all things to all people in their podcast. And it would seem to me if you can identify who your audience is, and then, more or less promote or tailor your content towards that audience,
absolutely,
then you're going to eventually be able to grow that audience.
That's right. Yeah, and I've done a little bit of coaching with folks who started podcasts, giving them some feedback. One thing that I always say is when I've clicked on your podcast on an app, I know already what it's going to be about. It'll say episode 10, here's the guest, and then you don't need to spend 20 minutes saying who the guest is. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Maybe give a little background, but then dive into the interview. Get to the meat. Don't leave people wondering where this is going and when you're going to get to the questions.
Right.
So do you think what do you see on the horizon, I guess? I was going to start to ask, do you see that filtering out in terms of people producing podcasts? I mean, obviously there's new technology coming online all the time in terms of how people use things, but new platforms, et cetera. But at some point there has to be some sort of shakeout, consolidation. I mean, like anything in life, there's a lot of people that try and a lot of people that fail, probably more that fail than succeed. What do you see in terms of trends? What have you seen in terms of over the couple of years that you've been doing coaching, and what has been the landscape shift, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I think I see a lot of people continuing to try the podcast, just like they may have tried a blog or having their own website 10 years ago, and deciding whether it really is going to make any money for them. I do see people hiring producers and finding that really does help when you have some professional help, if you're really going to go for it. And then I've seen people just say, listen, there's only 2 people listening to my podcast each week. I'm just not going to keep doing this. I mean, that probably should happen more often. I also see news sites really turning to podcasts. I know both NPR and Bloomberg have a number of podcasts that are some very successful, some not. But they know their listeners are not in the car all the time. Live radio is really struggling with keeping listeners. I know the 11 minutes is the average listening time for people in a car listening to the radio. And so I see a lot of news outlets turning to podcasts so people can get their news on demand when they want it, whether they're washing dishes or cooking dinner or something like that. But in terms of the individual podcasts, it's really hard to predict the future. And I think people can keep going as long as they want, right? I mean, who am I to stop anybody?
No, absolutely. It just seems to me that to your point, there's probably a lot of people who have tried and failed and move on to other, whether it's the topic that's wrong, whether it's the talent that's wrong, or what have you. I think there's so many variables towards success, and we all know that everything's a funnel, right? There's just very few that come out the bottom that are successful.
Right.
And it really depends how you define those success metrics too.
Yeah.
Right? It's not everybody's trying to make a living. Some people are trying to do it informational or what have you. So it really depends on what the mission is and what they're trying to create.
Let's talk about generational differences for a little bit. I mean, a lot of people always went to go to the news, 5 o'clock news, 7 o'clock news to go get everything. They'd get their Sunday paper, read it, see what's going on. But today, you can see things on Instagram, you can see things on Facebook. Are people really watching the news as much as they used to? And then what about I would say 15-year-old to 30-year-old market? Is there going to be a new wave of how people are going to be getting their information in the future?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I really hope people remain committed to knowing what's going on in the world, even though it's pretty bleak a lot of the time. I think that a lot of folks wake up and turn on a podcast. I mean, one of my best friends hosts The 7 from the Washington Post, which are the 7 news headlines with maybe a paragraph of information that you need to know for the day. And she talks about how their demographic is fairly young. And then there are my parents who sit down and still watch Channel 5 every single night at 5 o'clock. So it just depends. Like you're saying, the demographics skew older for local news. That's not to say it's not important. What's interesting is local news stations, from my observations in the Boston area, are hiring new anchors who are very young, who have a lot of Instagram and TikTok followers. That seems to be as important, dare I say, as a journalism degree and experience. So for better or for worse, they're
all about the ratings, the numbers.
In ratings, numbers, and social media followers. And when I see TV reporters out in the field, I can't knock them because they are working really hard. Not only are they gathering news and editing it down for the air, they're also having to do live. They were tweeting live. They were on TikTok.
Stories,
they're on Instagram. I'm live at the scene. It's exhausting to try to perform on so many different platforms at the same time while you're actually listening to the governor's press conference. It's pretty wild. But I mean, the future of news is a whole other conversation. For me, it's about choosing an outlet that I trust and going back to that outlet every day at a certain time, consuming as much news as I can. I try to limit myself to 15 minutes a day personally for my mental health. But some people are reading news 24/7 on their phones. I just don't know how you can really process that all day, every day.
Yeah, and I think to your point, it really depends on what those sources are, and because there are so many sources, and is it real news or is it commentary? Is it is it editorializing? What have you? So it's fascinating that the landscape's become so complicated, and you sort of fear for the younger generations in terms of what are they consuming, and where are they getting their news from, and I hate to use the term, but starts with an F and it's 4 letters, and but there's a lot of that out there, right?
Yeah.
It's just not factually accurate,
right?
But that seems to fly today too, so it's frightening.
I know. I think about my kids because I moved back to my hometown of Lincoln, Mass, and we used to have the Lincoln Journal, which was the the weekly paper, and you would see your softball team in it once a year, and it was so exciting, and you would learn all about current events. And now my town doesn't have that, and we just have this long email listserv where people are fighting all the time about development in town, and it's wait, is this the news source? Is this what we're doing? Yeah. And it's tough. It's tough.
Well, we're all about changes. I mean, we're about entrepreneurs and radio entrepreneurs. It's, if there's one thing entrepreneurs are used to, it's change, right? If you don't like something, it's going to change. And that's, I think, very much the state of the world today. We're in flux, but it's been a real pleasure having a seasoned journalist on the show. I think it's my first time talking with somebody, well, at least on the show. It has a seasoned journalist. Our guest has been Anne Mostue, former news anchor for Bloomberg and NPR, and my guest co-host, Evan Macedo, Sapers and Wallack. It's been a real pleasure.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure to be here. Always a home run when we have somebody like you on our show as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much.
Excellent. We'll be right back with another segment on Radio Entrepreneurs.